Right, so this is my first time with a microphone, so it's a bit weird hearing my own voice, but let's see. So I've got some good news for you. My talk does not have any code. So we can take a little break before lunch. I know we're all hungry. Right, so when we think of craftsmanship, quite often we think of clean code. We think of certain XP practices. We even think of design and types and all these things, and this is all good. It's great, in fact. But I think we've got more to learn, and we can learn some more by thinking a little deeper, by taking a bit more of a philosophical look at what craftsmanship is in general, and what software craftsmanship means to us specifically. Right. So everyone has read some books. Some people have written some of these that actually have a bit of a profound effect. So every book has an effect, but some actually have a bit of a seismic effect in you. And these are some of the ones that have an effect on me throughout my career. These are the books that I read, and afterwards I wasn't the same. I read them again and again and again, and every time I read them, I learn something new. So most of you would recognize most of these books. Who has read Elements of Style, by the way? Right, not many. I thoroughly recommend it. It's about the English language, and it's about crafting your sentences, right? I'm still a beginner. Okay. Just like those books, I've had the pleasure to read this one as well. Who's read this book? Not many. Okay, so I can tell you everything about it, and it will probably be new. Right, so Richard Sennet wrote a philosophical inquiry into the nature of craftsmanship. And the first time I read it, it was a bit of a eureka moment. There were so many insights. It was packed full of insights. And I've read it 3 times after that as well. And every time I learned something new. Right, so I thoroughly recommend you read this book. Most of the ideas that I have in this talk come from this book. Right. The book is a bit academic, so it takes a while to glean the knowledge out of it, but it's definitely worth the investment. Okay. So one of the biggest insights in this book is that at no point does it describe software craftsmanship or craftsmanship as a metaphor. It describes software as a craft, but it describes it as a direct description, not a metaphor. Which is quite interesting, because we talked about initially when the idea of software craftsmanship introduced, it was referred to as a metaphor. And I myself have always referred to it as a metaphor, but this was a great insight. So looking deeper into what a metaphor is, it's a thing regarded as representative or symbolic, but not literally applicable. What I disagree, craftsmanship or craft is directly applicable to my profession. So to me, sorry, there is a bit of code in there. To me, software is a craft. Software craftsmanship is a direct description of our profession. So that was a great insight I had. And we talked about, Nat talked about the ideas of a metaphor. And this actually works really well, because it actually gives us some critical distance from a metaphor. Like, I don't know, the carpenter's craft, or the surgeon, or the dentist, whichever other metaphors we use, it gives us some critical distance. It helps us learn from those metaphors, but also gives us a distance to see that our profession is also a craft, but it is not that craft. We can learn from there, but we can also innovate. We can apply new innovative ideas. We can evolve our craft. Okay, so in this talk, I've taken these insights and I've divided them into 2 things. The why and the what. The why is the motivation. And taking a philosophical look into craftsmanship in general, and software craftsmanship specifically, it helps us understand what the motivations are. What really motivates us. In Daniel Pink's Drive, when he talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose, this is the bit that helps me understand the purpose part a bit deeper. And the nature of skill. All of us are forever learning skills. thinking about skills helps. Thinking about how we acquire skills, how we teach skills to others, and how we apply skills, and how our skills evolve helps, right? So when we talk about why, the moral imperative is not enough. For us to, what motivates us, it would be nice that, you know, we'd all hopefully have some moral values and we do a good job. We do a great job because it's a moral imperative, either from a community perspective, social perspective, or from a competition perspective. But it's not enough. It is not the thing, or in its entirety, not the thing that motivates us. We have to look deeper to see what motivates us. So there's a bunch of things I'm going to talk about in this manner. There's motivation and talent, human impulse. There's forces that actually act against that impulse, the how and the why, and unequal workplaces. And these are the things, the insights that I have in terms of understanding what actually motivates us. Talking about motivation, there's a great quote in there, and it's something along the lines of, motivation matters more than talent. In fact, if you have talent, you can get obsessed. And if you do not have the right kind of motivation, you can just get obsessed about the practice itself, but not the value that you are bringing out of that practice. A motivation, on the other hand, if you have motivation to do a job well, you can actually, talent of course helps, but you can use that to organize your obsession towards doing that job well, and you will end up in a better place than a person who is just talented but does not have the motivation to provide value. So, one of the greatest insights in there is that craftsmanship actually, turns out, is a human impulse. All of us have it hardwired into us, a desire to do a job well for its own sake. And this is where the craftsmanship comes through. We all want to do a good job, and we take pleasure in doing it. When we do a good job, we take satisfaction and pleasure out of it. But when we are trying to do a job well, or we're trying to do a good job and we're following our impulse, there are other things that actually can stop us from doing that, can suppress this very natural impulse for us to try and do a job well and get satisfaction and be motivated by that job well done. And those are competitive pressures. So for example, we can get competitive because someone else we see that is doing a job much better, and suddenly it becomes about us and not about the thing we are doing. It's not about doing the job well, but it's about us showing to someone that we can do a great job. And this actually has a demotivating effect. It actually works against the impulse, the natural impulse we have, the inner satisfaction we have. We know when we've done a job well. And similarly, frustration. So how many times we want to do a great job, we go to work, we think that this idea will definitely work, and someone comes and stamps on it, right? This is also a demotivating factor. So stopping that impulse, stopping the people's impulse to do a job well actually leads to frustration, and again, that suppresses that impulse that we all share. And obsession. We talked about obsession earlier, right? When we get obsessed about a particular thing, then what starts to matter is what the maker, what we can do, rather than what the object does, right? So this also spirals down towards that dissatisfaction, because in the end we know, yes, we've done a great job in showing what we can do, but the thing we were doing is not good, or is not actually, the value is not in the thing but us showing what we're doing. And again, that starts working on that impulse, and it starts demotivating us, right? So we've had quite a checkered past, in fact, with craftsmanship. Even up till, I mean, this Hannah Arendt, she wrote about what she refers to as animal labyrinth and homo faber. An animal labyrinth basically is describing a human who's effectively close to like a beast of burden, a person who is really engrossed in the task itself, but not asking the whys, right? And then the Homo faber, which actually means man the maker, is the person that has the critical view, is the one that's asking why. So this has often been divided throughout history. In fact, Aristotle himself wrote that the architect has the true idea and the reasons behind what is being built, and the builder is just doing the architect's bidding, separating the Homo faber from the animal labyrinth. And in fact, the enlightened view is that that's not good. That's not good for craftsmanship. That's not good for any craft. And if we can take a parallel into our own world, we can take parallels into teams that are just given tasks or stories without any real value, that we are just going ahead and building these things. We are working off a backlog as if that backlog is the means to an end. We are effectively working in that animal labyrinth mode. We are engrossed in the task itself, but not asking what the task is for, why. We are not engaging our other mode, which is the Homo faber mode, right? So the how and the why are completely linked. We've always, when you do something, you actually learn, and that informs the why, and the why informs the how. And that's how we make. The thinking and the feeling in any craft, including ours, is actually linked and is inextricably linked. When they are divided, the things start happening. Like, for example, let's take any of our practices. Let's even take test-driven development, right? Kevin Henney talked about red, green. What was the other thing? Reflect, right? We stop reflecting. We are no longer engaging the why. And we are no longer innovating what we are doing. We are stuck in a time warp and just following the task like a drudge and not thinking about what it actually means, what the value behind this is, right? So the task of making, again, is just a part of us, but we also take the responsibility of the results. That's what craftsmanship means. Now, taking the what and the what and the how, I talked about, rather the why and the how. I talked about, we being in places, for example, in teams where we are just getting tasks to do. And again, this idea comes from quite far away. There is this story about Stradivarius, and I'm not sure if it's true, but apparently A. Stradivarius, the violin, if it was made at the time when Stradivari was alive, sounds very different and is much more prized than when he died. And his sons took over the workshop. So what happened? What happened that suddenly when that person went away, he was the one who created this workshop. He had apprentices, he had craftsmen, he had his, lots of people that he was teaching to, yet they could not produce the same quality when he was gone. And that boils down to, again, the unequal workplaces. When we have unequal workplaces, we don't transfer the skill on. We don't allow the team as a concept to emerge that is much more long-lived rather than the individuals. And this is, again, has the impact on motivation as well, on our craft. So it leads to a thing called fractured skill. And this is, again, a concept in craftsmanship throughout history. It's about nature of skill, and I'll describe that later. So unequal workplaces are everywhere in our profession. Whether that is because the production services, the people who manage the production instances are somewhere else, or people who are looking at the business are somewhere else, and so on. These are unequal workplaces. Our head and the hand is divided in many ways. So let's look at the nature of skill. So we had a bit of a look into motivation. There is a lot more in the book as well if you want to kind of dig deeper, and there's a lot more in books like Drive and so on. But this was just to whet your appetite in terms of what motivation means to us. So let's look at nature of skills. Let's see what happens when we try to learn a skill. First of all, let's look at learning. We learn through observation and experimentation. That's a bit obvious, isn't it? But is it? Often we look at the first time that we are doing something is the time we are writing the production code, right? So we are actually taking the first step in learning at the time when we need to write the code itself. But actually, learning is a process of trial and error. And if you look at it as a journey, it's many errors to start with, and you learn to make less errors in any skill, whether that's testing and development, whether that's good design skills, that's CI, or you're solving a particular problem or building a particular feature. Experimentation is key, right? Teaching is also very important, and in terms of how we teach. We often say to people, right, do TDD. Red, green, refactor. Red, green, refactor. But often we don't show them how we've done it. So the observation aspect goes away. We kind of just say to them, this is how it's done. Do some katas. And often they're not observing. And we've actually really made it very rigid in terms of what they need to learn or how they need to learn it. Paul actually talked about setting the goal, but then giving them the freedom on how to achieve that goal. That is an important part of learning. This is how we learn. If the way we learn is a journey from a path of many to few errors, then what about perfection? Where do we stop? Is it many to zero errors? Is that where we stop? Again, the obsession comes into play. Again, it works against our human impulse to go for perfection. But the obsession to go for perfection, on the other hand, also allows us to do a kata over and over and over again to learn. So what is it? Is obsession a good thing or a bad thing? Well, actually, organized obsession is a good thing. Untamed obsession is a bad thing. Understanding that there is a balance between perfection and pragmatism, and we must find our own balance through practice and experience, is the right thing, is the good thing. So if perfection is, or trying to achieve for perfection is a good thing, but also balancing it with pragmatism is the right thing. But does that mean that pragmatism is compromise? So we are pragmatic. Often people say, oh, let's be pragmatic about this, meaning let's compromise, right? Let's just stop doing what we're doing. Actually, that's not true. That's not what pragmatism is. Pragmatism is a force. It's a force. So let me talk to you about material focus, and then I'll get back to pragmatism. Imagine, let's take the metaphor of a wood carver, a wood craftsman. They have what's known as a type form in mind. They'll take a block of wood, they think they're going to make a shape out of this wood. They're going to carve a shape out of this wood. That's in their head. They have a very generic view, a type form of what this thing is going to be like. Then they look at the material, the wood itself. They look at the tools they have, and they start chipping away at it, using various different tools. Suddenly, they're encountered with knots in the wood. The way the grains of the wood is one way in one side and the other way on other different sides. They know what this object needs to be. They know what the qualities, the strengths and the weaknesses and the unexpected aspects and features of that material are. And they incorporate all those things together to get to a point where they have a beautiful object. It wasn't the one that was in their head. It has that type form. It has that generic shape, but it is something concrete and beautiful, leveraging all the strengths and weaknesses of that material. So leveraging the strengths and the weaknesses of that material and understanding where you are constrained is actually part of pragmatism. But it's a force. It helps you create the best thing, a perfect thing. Okay? And again, taking this back to the hand and the head, this is only a metaphor. It's only a way to understand what we do. We do something at our materials are much larger. The software we produce is much larger. The domain that we work in is big. It takes us a much longer time to finish something. The thing that we produce is intangible. But still, the lessons matter. Even in this, the image of this wood carver carving this object, even in that, their head and hand are working in absolute unison. The hand is doing, they are reflecting, is providing feedback, and they are changing that type form in the head and utilizing the tools they have to create the best thing. But they have this into the detail and out again as an absolute regular thing, to the point where they don't even realize that they are doing it. It becomes second nature to them. Can it become second nature to us? Can we always be in these two places at once, the detail and the overall? Maybe it's much more difficult, but we should definitely give it a try. I talked about fracture skill earlier. So fracture skill is extremely relevant because this is something we suffer from a hell of a lot. Whether that is at the business level. Sorry, how much time have I got left? 20 minutes. Okay. So whether that is at the business level or at the minute level where we are doing our TDD cycles or where we are developing code. So an example, I've often seen, especially in places where we're dealing with a lot of legacy code, that they will do something, people do something, they get something compiling, a few minutes later they might even go for a coffee, they see the results, they say, oh yeah, this didn't work, come back. Or even something that is, they make a change and then they wait, let's say, a minute to see what that change did. It is still fractured. You can, if you have a gap, an unnatural gap between the doing and seeing the results so that you can reflect, what happens is that your mind is no longer in there. It no longer becomes second nature. So the head and the hand become divided. So suddenly that feedback loop of making or doing and feeling goes away and the skill is fractured. That's at the lowest level. But also at the highest level, why is continuous deployment or continuous delivery, or however you might define it, why is that so important? Again, it's the same thing, that our hand and the head need to be together. They need that feedback loop. Why are we always looking to reduce that feedback loop at all levels? It's actually to stop this epidemic of fractured skill that exists in our profession. Minimal force is also an important point when we're talking about skill and application of skill. Minimal force is, and this is a Chinese proverb, the Chinese have, in the kitchen they have a knife, a cleaver. In Europe we have many knives, like 10 or 12 for different things, the chefs. The Chinese chef has now maybe more, but they used to have a single knife. And they have a much bigger problem because the user, the eater, the person eating the food does not have a knife. So chopsticks can't cut, right? So they start learning to utilize that knife for everything, from carving to chopping to anything, you name it, and they start doing this. But they have this idea of minimal force, that when they are using that knife, when they are cutting something that is small, what amount of force they need to use, and something that's big. And that's where the proverb comes from, that they need to be able to first cleave a grain of boiled rice in order to understand the importance of minimal force. How does that apply to us? Well, in many ways. In fact, minimal force is the framework that we are using, the language that we are using, the process that we are using, even our business plan for the product that we are creating. Right? This is all to do with minimal force. Are we applying minimal force, or are we using a sledgehammer to crack a nut? And often we are using the sledgehammer to crack a nut. Often, the first thing we think about, for example, in Java especially, even before we think of what the problem is, I think Spring Boot will do it. It's a big thing. It's a tool. It's a great tool. But is it the right thing for every single job? Is Java the right thing for everything, or C# the right thing for everything, right? Again, the old adage that, if you have a hammer, everything is not a nail, right? This idea of minimal force is important to our work. Generic versus the specific. Michael Feathers talked about it earlier, about the different levels of abstractions and what we use. And in fact, this has been common throughout history. So take an example of a paper guillotine. Does everyone know what a paper guillotine is? It's a thing that is used to cut a straight line in a piece of paper. Right? That's all it does. It cuts an amazingly straight line in a piece of paper. You could do the same thing with a scalpel. You could cut an amazingly straight line with a scalpel. But in order to use the scalpel to do that, you need a lot of skill. In fact, surgeons are craftsmen because they have to spend thousands of hours in understanding, maybe not now with the laser surgeries and everything, but they spend thousands of hours understanding how to use the scalpel with minimal force. So a scalpel is not a good tool in this case. Scalpel is a generic tool, and a guillotine is a specific tool. Often, they call it the ambiguous and the sublime. So the ambiguous, scalpel is an ambiguous thing. You can do many things with it. Sublime, on the other hand, is completely unambiguous. It will let you do something with very little skill, but do that thing well. So is Vim, for example, the generic or the ambiguous? And I don't know, IntelliJ IDEA, the sublime? I don't know, maybe not. IntelliJ IDEA, in my view, is also a generic, but it's a gradual kind of scale, right? So on that scale, the IntelliJ IDEA could also be generic. But there is an important thing to learn in here. Actually, and again that goes back to the talk by Michael Feathers earlier as well, is that when we are, even in craftsmanship, resistance and ambiguity are instructive experiences. So when we are challenged by the tools that we have, our imagination kicks in, our learning kicks in, and we learn how to do that work well. Like, for example, if you look at the air traffic controllers, they have a horrible, horrible interface, but they are looking at managing all the planes in the air. Hey, do you know that this is a manual work, by the way, deciding which planes land where and where they are? It's quite scary, isn't it? Now, people have tried to provide better interfaces, amazing UIs. They hate them because they've taken something that was ambiguous and they've used their imagination and they've perfected their skill, they've perfected their craft with those tools. And they're amazing at it with them. The same goes for using higher order abstractions or APL constructs. I've had the pleasure to see someone actually write the APL kata in live, and it was an instructive experience. There was a craftsman at work, really was. So generic and specific, it's not generic versus specific, it's generic and specific. We need to look at the generic, we need to master the generic, but also master the specific or the sublime. I know there's a pun in there with the sublime text somewhere. Okay. What's the conclusion? Thinking deeper helps with the mindset. Again, a bit obvious. But the obvious needs to be stated, right? When we start thinking deeper about our skill, about our practices, about what we do, when we sometimes just sit back and think what we are doing, what motivates us, the tools that we use, why we use them, and taking this philosophical point of view and understanding the conflicts, the challenges that other craftsmanship related professions have had in past, and learning from the history and their thinking, but also innovating ourselves, helps us understand where we are in our skill, helps us understand where we need to go, helps us understand what motivates us, what's important and what's not important. So to recap it all, craftsmanship is not a metaphor. Software craftsmanship is a direct description of our profession. We need to leverage this impulse we have, the human impulse to do the job well for its own sake. Isn't that amazing? We have that impulse. So we need to leverage it, and we need to look at the forces that conflict, whether they are of our own creation or of organizational or social or competition, whatever it is. We need to identify first, what are they? What is it that's stopping us from doing the job well for its own sake? And we need to learn through experimentation. We need to understand the importance of experimentation. And we need to understand that experimentation is not just for the job. It's not just to, when we get the next feature, we say, oh shit, I don't know how this will work. But anyway, let's get started and we'll see how it turns out. But experiment, learn. And we need to be able to organize our obsession. That it's not just about this tool, it's not just about this technology, it's not just about how quickly I do my TDD cycles. But they are great ways for us to hone our skill. And we need to be pragmatic, and we need to use pragmatism as a force to do the job well. And we need to apply minimal force. So when we are doing something, we need to apply just enough force for that thing to be done. No more, no less. And we need to master the generic and the specific. The specific lets us do a job well with efficiency. The generic helps us innovate. It provides that resistance and ambiguity that kicks our imagination into shape and lets us innovate in towards the future. So it's not just the tools that we use, it's the practices that we have. It's the way that we think. Okay, thank you.
Hi. Thank you. That was really good. Hello.
Thank you.
You talk about pragmatism. I think one of the things that I certainly face day to day is obviously we have time-critical tasks and deadlines. And so how do you apply craft when you can do something really quickly to meet a deadline versus do something that's going to take quite a long time? And that's something that I struggle with, you know, craftsmanship and also being quite practical and pragmatic.
So this goes down to material focus. The schedule that we have, the business objectives have some sort of a time constraint. That's part of our material, right? So then going back to material focus, if we focus on that part of the material, do we understand it well? Do we understand this deadline well? Is this deadline just made by someone because they have a spreadsheet somewhere that they've just happened to put it there? Or does this have a real meaning? If it has a real meaning, it's part of our material. And then we work with that material. And then we use that material to craft the right thing for that right time. So yes, sometimes that material, sometimes that knot in that piece of wood, the whole thing would be a knot. And we may even have to stop with our type form and say this thing won't even fit in there. But then we need to see what will fit in there. Or do we need to just say this can't be done? But at the end of the day, we need to consider those things in a much more meaningful way. And we need to think of what is a real deadline and what is something of someone's making. Does that make sense?
Hi, again, thank you for the presentation, it was amazing. I just have a quick question regarding the fact that craftsmanship is not a metaphor. So in my imagination at least, craftsmen are their own master. So is craftsmanship compatible with the classic hierarchy structure that we can find in companies?
So again, that's why I said that we need to look at our craft as our craft. So looking at historically, looking at certain ways that things were organized, there would be masters and journeymen and so on. I personally am not a big fan of this. And trying to impose those metaphors into our hierarchical structure, I think we're asking ourselves the wrong question. Why do these structures need to exist? What is the need behind them? I think is the right question to ask. What are the control aspects that, let's say, the business is not getting and they are having to add these things, or we ourselves are not getting that we are creating these hierarchies? And then in that case, then we identify, for example, in our company, we don't have hierarchies, we have roles. We have things that people can perform. That does not mean that this person is above this person or above. It just shows where they are at a particular time and what roles they can perform. So maybe that's another way of looking at it. But that does not fit the master, the journeyman, the apprentice. But we do have, for example, apprentice, because that actually fits well because there is a focus on learning. So, you know, you can keep a critical distance away from the metaphors, but still learn from them.
Okay, if there's any more questions, I think Mash will be available during lunch. Thank you very much.
Thank you.